Welcome to the Tampa Bay Meetup. Just to give you a little bit of context about who I am, my name is James Gress. I lead the North America DevOps Solution Factory out of the Tampa Advanced Technology Center. We put this meetup together to be able to help grow Tampa Bay and see what other people are doing across the Tampa Bay area around DevOps and modern engineering. Our team really does get to work with some of the latest, greatest technologies, and we like to share it with our local community as well as, see what other folks are doing. It was early this year, late last year, we had some folks from the DoD kind of show us what they were doing. That was very interesting. And we're always looking for speakers. So if you're interested, drop me a note. Topic can be big, small, covering anything DevOps, transformation, or anything you might think is relevant for the community. And we especially like to see what the local DevOps practitioners are doing out in the area. Or if there's any kind of topic you want to hear about, drop me a note and we can try to get that arranged. Please be aware this is going to be a recorded event and will be posted on YouTube later this week. Quick guidelines for the call. Please keep your phone on mute unless you're asking a question or presenting some content. We encourage video. It helps us feel more social and engaging. And at the end, we're going to open it up for questions and feel free to add some questions to the chat window. And there could even be times within the discussion where we open it up as well.
Yeah, I think we have some people waiting to be let in, James, too.
Thank you.
Yeah, just keep an eye out, for folks. They might be sitting in the lobby.
Absolutely. Thanks for the reminder. And I'll try to keep up on that. For the next event, I'll try to make it so that it's automatic. It looks like Zoom's putting some new features in that I wasn't aware that was going to kick in this time around. But we have an upcoming meetup with Synology. They're going to talk about comprehensive license-free backup and storage on May 13th. If you guys can make that. For this event, we have CloudBees, Rich and Greg. At the end of the event, we're going to be giving away a $100 Amazon gift card. So that's going to be awesome. And today we're going to have Rich and Greg talk about CloudBees, what's going on with some of the things that are going on out there in the marketplace today, some of the challenges our clients are having. And the main topic is going to be how to deploy more features more frequently with less risk. So Rich, I'll hand it off to you, and then you can go back and forth with Greg.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks, James. And good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking some time on a Thursday afternoon. My name is Rich Blank. I'm the director of the Southeast region for CloudBees. I've been with the company about 2 years. And, look, I'll tell you, I'll get into this, in just a sec in terms of some slides. And really the idea here, the goal here is to educate you kind of about what feature management is, why it's important, certain capabilities of what a solution might look like. And Greg will do a demonstration for you at the end to kind of put this all in context and so you can visually see how this all plays together. I think, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring that, of course. And, if we need to pause and answer any questions for you, we're happy to. There will be time at the end as well to just stay on. Greg is, he's a really sharp guy. He's a developer. He's one of our developer evangelists. Greg, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? You're on mute. There you go.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Like Rich said, my name is Greg Avsik. I'm a solutions architect with CloudBees, evangelist internally. So do a lot of speaking on kind of the technical side of things about what CloudBees does and how we can help out developers, hopefully.
Awesome. Well, I will jump into this and go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll get this going. All right. And we'll do this slideshow here. Oops, wrong button there. There you go. Play from the current slide. Excellent. And I'm going to make the assumption that you folks can see my screen. All right. You see my presentation? Not yet? Well, that's not good.
We're seeing you, but not the slides.
Yeah, I am sharing my screen. Let me do this. Let me just turn off my video and try sharing this one more time. How about,
Yeah, I can
Yep,
see
you
that.
can see it now.
there we go. Much
Great.
better. All right. So you see my slides?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right. We took care of the introduction. So let me just give you the quick overview of CloudBees so you guys know who we are if you haven't heard of us. You know, traditionally we've been known as the Enterprise Jenkins company. If you've got, I'm sure everyone's heard of Jenkins. If you haven't, it's you know, been around a long time. Very common CI tool. You know, sometimes it's used for CD too. But we commit, you know, like 80% of the code to Jenkins. You know, the open source platform. Very heavily involved with it. Our CTO, you know, created Jenkins actually, and that's really where we started our you know, our journey. We've been in business about 10 years. As things evolved and our DevOps has evolved and our customers said, hey, you know, can you help us and add more value? You know, we've got a lot of different tools in our tool chain. You know, we've acquired a few companies and done some things, you know, to innovate. And right now, you know, we do a lot more than just Enterprise Jenkins. You know, we have solutions that really cross the entire end-to-end software delivery life cycle, where we've got solutions around continuous delivery as well, release orchestration. We've got visibility and insights as well. And we also more recently are more coming soon. This is a little bit of a preview. We're focused on some new things. This is really, you know, new innovation that's coming. That's actually in preview with customers, and we're delivering it this year. Is something around software delivery management. Again, it's really looking at the holistic end-to-end from idea to value, and saying how can we create a common data model? How can we have more universal insights across the entire life cycle? Whether it's a lot of disconnected silos, a lot of disconnected processes, and create, you know, more collaboration and connectedness across there with everybody kind of functioning off a single pane of glass, where you've got more visibility and insights to exactly what's going on and where things are at any given point in time. It's really pretty exciting. Nobody's really doing this at the level we are, and you know, just wanted to let you know, hey, we're much more than Enterprise Jenkins. We're doing a lot in the marketplace, but you know, for today's purpose, what we're going to do is really zero in on this notion of, you know, feature management, or this idea that, you know, how do you actually, you know, do more with less, right? Deploy more software, deploy more features more frequently, you know, and do it with quality, right? And think about how do you mitigate risk, right? I think this notion of move fast, break things. I mean, people have heard that. Facebook was kind of the, you know, I think the ones who championed that whole term in the very beginning. But you know, when you think about this, obviously we all know we move most organizations have moved from kind of the waterfall to agile. Some are kind of a mix still, you know, depending on where you are in your DevOps journey. You know, work has been broken down into smaller, you know, chunks, if you will, you know, with you know, microservices and those kind of things. And obviously with breaking that work up, you know, is helps mitigate the risk, because you're, you know, moving smaller changes into production and trying to get feedback faster. But, you know, there's still risk, and, you know, you want to accelerate what you do and obviously isolate the blast. But there's, you know, there's risk and chaos still in this process. And, you know, this notion of testing and production, if you will, you know, just to simplify this a little bit, I mean, you know, it's not just the thing startups do. I mean, you know, we talk with you know, Fortune 1000 customers all the time, from regulated organizations, and they all, you know, are asking us about this. How, you know, not that they have to release thousands of times a day, but there is a need, right, to say, well, we don't really know how things are going to behave. We have to move fast. I mean, you think about this COVID-19 that's going on. You know, obviously think about the doing more with less, you know, concept in terms of making your developers more productive and focused on you know, the customers, you know, digitally, and making sure that you can respond, you know, as quick as possible if you have to make changes to software. You know, the idea is that, you know, this isn't something that, you know, obviously these companies have been doing it a while. They probably pioneered it because there wasn't anything out there. They had to build certain, you know, homegrown, you know, ways of approaching testing and production. So, you know, I think it's important to understand that, and there's different ways, you know, they did it. It could be command line arguments or undocumented variables, config files. I mean, hidden values. I mean, all kinds of ways to approach this that are all over the place, depending on the development team, of course, you talk to. Because, I mean, for most of our customers that we deal with, most of the organizations, I mean, the reality here is that we all know building and releasing software is very complicated. Obviously, like I mentioned, I mean, there's a push to agile, there's a push to microservices and cloud. Obviously everyone, is trying to do some type of automation within, this DevOps transformation that they're doing and breaking work into smaller chunks and smaller releases. But testing in production is still very risky. And there's a lot of complexities and dependencies in this software release cycle that, when you think about, the infrastructure and segmentation and different things that, okay, well, how do you do that? How do you move fast among this complexity, in a very, agile way, but, make sure you're not breaking things too much, because, depending on the organization you're in, there's risks. There's risk to your brand reputation, risk, costs, and risk to people's, personal jobs, right? If things are broken or their security, right? There's all kinds of things that go on. And the reality we see, with respect to enterprise software delivery, when you think about the status quo, right, it can be, costly here. When you think about just, the collaboration that happens out there, right? The tools, the practices that, developers created traditionally, right? They're, release software, sometimes, they're slow or they're big bang type approaches, more version based in some cases. And, the practices that kind of developed, I mean, while, we're better at it, we're a little more agile at what we do, of course, the notion of that, you can test all you want, but the test environments don't necessarily fully recreate production. And, with the complexity and multiple scenarios in testing, that takes time, it takes money, right? It's slower. And when a new feature is, released, you have to think about how do we rapidly innovate? How do we rapidly experiment more? That's kind of the notion here of what we're getting at. When you really kind of drill this down into kind of the pains or, personas in software delivery, you look at this across the board and, there's all kinds of different folks that are involved in the end-to-end process, right? From product owners and developers and QA to, sales and marketing and support and operation folks. And when you look at this, I mean, there's the product folks, they care about, right, maybe beta testing something to see how's this going to really work in the real world. Can we have some kind of targeted, tests that we can do? Are there analytics we can gain from that? Can we experiment and maybe innovate some things to very select audiences without, releasing it to perhaps everybody? Obviously the release folks, a lot of times it's just an all or nothing here. It's the entire application, right? And if something's broken, you got to figure out a way to roll it back, in its entirety. Obviously there's ways to, even though some of that may be manual or scripted in some sense, there's a big push in, to automate and drive more efficiencies there with approvals and stage gates and all kinds of, compliance oriented things and security based things that you have to think about where that's what some other folks care about, right? And then of course, getting feedback, right, from support, the end users, maybe their bugs, security issues, rollback changes, et cetera. These are all things that, obviously you guys, if you're in DevOps and depending on what your role is, these are things I'm sure you care about. So what we hear from a lot of customers is this notion that, how do you really separate, the notion of deployment from release? When you think about this, just deploying something, right, doesn't necessarily equate to release. And how do you kind of decouple feature delivery from the code release, cycle? I mean, I think hopefully folks are familiar with, continuous, release and continuous deployment type, what those are within the concept of DevOps. But, the idea that, look, the notion of delivering software is kind of the precursor to actually deploying it. But, if releasing it is kind of the thing, and deployment's kind of the process and the principles in which you go about releasing into a live environment. And when you decouple, deployment from release, you control the exposure of the code, without really having to do a full rollback of the entire application, and you can really enable teams to ship more often with greater safety, and that's kind of the idea here, and what we're getting at. And that's really, when you think about this whole thing called feature flags, there's different words that you may get thrown around. Some call it progressive delivery, if you will. But to simplify it, feature management, feature flag is really the most simple kind of definition, if you will. I think that if we want to define it, and look, it's a toggle, it's a switch. It's just a technique that helps developers and product owners, maintain their source code branches, basically, with kind of an if-then type statement in the code, right? When you think about centralized management of these things, where instead of each developer team kind of creating these little config files that nobody has any idea really what they do except the developer, and if that developer leaves, who knows what that is or where those config files are and whatnot, and how to manage that at scale. And you have thousands of developers, thousands of applications in these organizations. How do you really create some governance around this, especially if you're talking about production environments and your production software? Greg, I know you're on there listening. Anything from a developer standpoint, do you want to add some color from your perspective and kind of your definition of feature flags?
Yeah, I think anyone on the call right now who has like developer experience or even DevOps experience, I think it should be, as a topic, it should be pretty familiar to you, right? I don't think feature flags are a new idea to anyone really, right? As you can see in Rich's slide, there's just an if-else statement, and then you're checking an environment variable, or you're checking against a config file, right? And then based on a certain property, a user property, for example, you're deciding which version of the code you're going to run. So like something really common is if a user is like a paying user or is just a regular user, right? Do they get a premium version of the website or something like that? So I think this idea on its own is very common. It's just, as you mentioned, once you start scaling it up, how do you then go about managing that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you think about, right, obviously things are calendar driven in terms of release cycles. And, I think that modern development teams, want, less pressure, if you will, in those time sensitive launches, and this notion of feature management, feature flagging, to kind of separate the code deployment from the actual feature releases is really critical, right? To kind of safely beta test, safely roll out new features when they're ready, and really get that feedback very quickly as needed. And sometimes there are unfinished features too that you're not quite ready, but hey, you want to get the release out there, and maybe they need to be hidden, in the short term, and iterated on. But again, this saves a lot of time. The idea is to save time and obviously provide governance around all that. So what I want to do now is actually, I want to dive. Oh, anything else, Greg?
No. I think you're.
Oh, you good? Okay.
I do have a question. Can I do
Yeah.
it?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Instead of doing payment flag, like the future, like asking for that is enabled or not, what is the best practice or approach, like doing using parameters and asking for the parameter instead of hard coding something that is enabled or not? What is the best recommendation for that?
Yeah, so I think that is a part of what comes with utilizing feature flags, right? Is that you will have these conditions in your code. You might not necessarily have a hard-coded flag name. Like you said, you can parameterize it if that's something you do, but that is kind of one of the aspects of utilizing feature flags in your code, right? Is I guess it's a little bit of a trade-off, the safety of a safe release, separating deploy from release, and now you're kind of splitting up the code into these if-else statements based on user parameters and things like that.
Yeah, I think that the idea here is that, in order to kind of separate the code deployment from the feature release, right? And traditionally this might have been done more manually or embedded in, config files and things like that. You want to have a system, right? That actually allows you to manage these this at scale with some governance around it, and the values, it's really speed and mitigating risk, of course. And what I think would be helpful, I'll kind of go into what the key capabilities are of such a system, right? To be thinking about, hey, imagine if you had a system that could allow you to do this really easily at scale across all your teams with the right kind of governance that, risk and compliance everybody else cares about. I'm sure that that's really the notion here to educate you guys about this. And again, the naming, feature flagging, toggling, progressive delivery, application experimentation. I mean, there's a lot of different names to this, but feature management is really the, what we'll call it. But look, again, the value of what this is, what we're trying to do is, like I said, drive efficiencies and reduce costs. And instead of having 12 developers standing around during an actual release, and for somebody to click a button or do something manually, how do you automate that process in a very healthy way? Or, how do you get the IT folks, to kind of get out of the release business and just say, hey, you're a product owner, you guys go and control, your own releases, and in a very, controlled, managed way. And of course, innovation, experimentation, and the measurement around this stuff, and you get into this, just some key things to think about, right? This notion of just at a very simple level, a kill switch, right? That it's reactive in nature, but look, if you remember not too long ago, right, the glitches that happened on Amazon, right? There were some glitches out there, but if you had to pull back a feature that caused some bug like this, imagine the cost and the risks, even to somebody like Amazon, to be able to pull something back really quickly before it gets out of control, right? And kind of turn off bad code and put it in safe mode, if you will, or having emergency patches, and without doing, again, full rollbacks that of the full application. And again, this is about time savings and mitigating the blast in this particular case, and kind of even having a full panel approach to showing what are these experiments going on across all these different tools. I guess, from this perspective, Greg, I mean, as a developer, this is, at a very basic level. I mean, you want to add anything to kind of this notion of the kill switch?
Not too much. I think you did a good job explaining. And then it doesn't have to be manual either, right? It's not like you have to be sitting there releasing something, watching it, and if something goes wrong, you turn it off, right? You can automate this part as well, which is really nice, where you have certain thresholds that you're measuring, and if you go above or below a certain threshold, you just call API call, shut down the feature, do a rollback without an actual deployment. Yeah,
I think that's important. That it is, it can be, you kind of automate the automation, if you will, that you can set the rules, right? And it's important to think about these capabilities to be able to say, I'm going to test in production, but if there are certain criteria, right? It's if then, right? That you can programmatically turn this on or off, perhaps, and have it, again, do this safely, test in production safely. I think that's really key with this. And of course, have the visibility and insights and some type of, approach holistically, dashboard or what have you, that, allows you to see what's going on. And I think it removes a lot of bottlenecks, in the process, in terms of, you think about your pipelines and branches and kind of merging all this together, to just do this more efficiently to test in production. So I think that's really key. The other piece here, right, this notion of, another kind of key capability, right, is gradual rollouts, of this type of system. And, the notion here, right, is just saying, hey, look, everyone knows Big Bang, it happens, and they're more risky. And, even though you're breaking up work into maybe smaller chunks, I think that, the feature deployment itself, right? You have the ability to kind of do those, canary type testing, if you will, and gradually roll out, the software in a way that, again, maybe it's, segmented by a particular percentage of your user base. Maybe it's by geography. Maybe it's internal employees versus your customers, beta beta test groups, you name it, right? To figure out how do we proactively, do release something new to smaller audiences, and then over time, expand the footprint when it's ready for prime time. Any color you want to add about this one, Greg?
Yeah, I think this use case is kind of the standard testing in production use case, right? What we mean by that is you have code out in production, but it's turned off for your customers or your actual user base, and it is turned on for your internal testing team or maybe your employees, right? They get the first go at this new feature, right? So the code is out there in your production environment. You're testing against the real production environment, right? It's not a staging environment where you hope that it behaves the same way in production, right? The code is there. You turn it on only for your testing team. And then once they've approved it, then you can turn it on in smaller and smaller batches to make sure that the blast radius, if something does go wrong, not too big of a blast radius. So that's the idea there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I think this really streamlines the process. It puts the power really in the hands of the product owners in particular. And again, I think this speaks to, hey, how do you kind of, your engineering teams, DevOps engineers or release, managers, how do you get out of the release business a little bit and put more, empower your product owners to do these kind of things on their own? Again, saves time, saves energy, saves money, and mitigates a lot of risk in doing this in production. Another key capability of these types of systems is the ability to segment users. Obviously it's fairly self-explanatory, but when you think about, homegrown solutions, they really struggle to do this because it's not easy to do. And, do you want to have your developers take time spent, on some of this administrative overhead and points and different things that, handle this, and as opposed to developing, things that are important for the user experience and driving, the customer experience and revenue, for example. I think it's really, when you think about a company like, Netflix, for example, they do this very well in terms of, delivering tailored content based on the device, for example. We have customers that, have different devices, from mobile devices to browser to set-top boxes, even, these media companies in particular, and they need to be able to figure out the right experience and do some A/B testing even across these different experiences. And we even have one media customer that they deal with a major sports league. You may have heard of it. They're not playing right now, but they have different digital experiences based on, are you live at the game versus being at home watching it on a Roku or an Apple TV or something like that. So, to be able to quickly iterate and be as innovative as possible, knowing that the digital experience that customers expect, this kind of stuff becomes really, 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 really critical, frankly, to how software is released and how you really can innovate and experiment.
Hey, Rich, this is Thomas Julius. That's actually my account. And one of the things that they've been able to do, which increases top line revenues, is be able to add new features on the fly, where instead of having to purchase all of the season or a specific team and all of the games, you can purchase specific packages and even just the fourth quarter of games where a lot of the action in that league tends to take place. So they've done it kind of in a way like prop bets work in Las Vegas, allowing them to just diversify their revenue streams and target specific personas and geographies based on their type of viewing patterns and what they're interested in to maximize their revenue. So it's not you buy the full season or you buy your favorite team, and that's the only offering that we have. And the only way for them to be able to do that at scale and without tons of risk is utilizing the features that CloudBees rollout allows them to do. So it's pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah, no, it's good. I think that there's a lot of use cases here like that to think about, the segmentation of not just the user population, but the user experience, be it premium experiences or, certain segments of like if somebody just wanted to watch the first 5 minutes of something or the last 2 minutes of something, be able to do that. And again, it's really, this is hard to do without, you know, a system in place.
That's that reason, because that actually is an example of adding top line revenue, which, you know,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
obviously there's been bottom line cost reductions we provided for them as well.
Mm-hmm.
When the project funded, we've noticed that you don't just need to be able to reduce costs. Also, companies, you know, really will prioritize a project if you can add top line revenue while also reducing risk and reducing bottom line costs. So those two things alone made it an absolute home run for them.
Yeah, no, that's good. Appreciate that. And a couple more, you know, key capabilities I'll cover here. You know, this notion of controlled releases, and we talked a little bit about this, just, you know, canary deployments, A/B testing, that kind of stuff. But you know, mitigating the risk to just a small percentage of users, and you know, I know Greg, you know, just from a developer standpoint, again, do you want to add anything here? Any other color around this?
Yeah, I think we touched on it a little bit, but I think the big focus here is that controlling the blast radius, right? Where you start off by releasing to a small percentage of users, and it's kind of the classic canary release approach, right? When you do start releasing a feature, release it to 1% of your user base to start. And then if everything goes great, you're running tests, you're measuring things like that. If everything goes great with the 1%, then you scale it up to 5 and then 10 and so on and so on. But, you know, as canary releases go, if something does go wrong, if something goes wrong with that 1%, right, you only released a bad feature to 1% of your user base. The other 99% doesn't know about it. So just having the ability to gradually roll something out like that, you're really controlling what can go wrong during a release, right? Instead of one big on switch for everyone at the same time, you're making sure you're constantly testing, really controlling that blast radius.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Another, you know, just kind of move this along. Another kind of focus, right, is we talked about speed a little bit, but, you know, when you think about what this type of system can do, is just, you know, it really does allow for a better CI process where, you know, again, we mentioned a little bit, but just the notion of those feature branches and trying to merge and complete code into the main branch. And I think it, you know, you think about predictability of releases and making sure they're going to be good, right, in production. And maybe there are late stage QA bugs, right? The QA folks love it because it's like, wait a minute, we found it really late in the process. Do we pull the entire application release now and roll it all back? And, you know, again, that can impact, costs and you know, the calendar target dates that people have to get things out. Again, Greg, you got any other color you want to add from your developer perspective on this one?
Yeah, I think from the developer point of view, the big one is like the long-lived feature branches. One of the pains there, right, is if you do have, you know, you've been working on this feature, hopefully it's good, it's just that 2-week sprint, but sometimes those feature branches live on and they live on and live on, right? And it's a month, or it's a month and a half. And then by the time it comes time to merge it back in, there's merge conflicts, there's other branches that you're conflicting with. And that can really slow down your just work cycle as a developer, right? Not to mention the actual deployment process and everything like that. So having the ability to merge in code that's incomplete, and I know that sounds kind of scary, but it's wrapped in a flag, so you know it's not going to be on, right? So you can move away from long-lived feature branches, move towards that trunk-based development approach. I think that does a lot in terms of just developer productivity and even developer happiness, right? Your developers don't want to be spending time fixing merge conflicts. And so if you can avoid that, they'll be developing more, which is really
exactly nice. Got to keep developers happy, man. That is important. You know it. And then, finally, just to kind of wrap this this section up here. I mean, when you think about this type of solution, this type of platform, it's got to be flexible. It has to have, be rule-based, right? We're talking about there might be certain dependencies in terms of, do these features get turned on or off? And as Greg mentioned, there might be rules around, thresholds and different things that happen within here. Secure, right? It's got to be a secure platform. You got to, know, hey, who can see what and who can deploy to what. I think one of the other things too that's really key we've seen with our customers is just you can't have this type of solution access any kind of PII information or customer data, and that's a big red flag. And you has to be non-invasive, right? And if this kind of centralized feature management solution goes down, it can't impact your applications, right? In any way. So, the multi-environment support is really critical. I mentioned, obviously in the media company business, those media companies, you have to deploy to set-top boxes and different, you have to support those multi-environments very nicely. And of course, a robust SDK is important because, again, you're going to want to automate the automation here. And in some cases, maybe tie some of these feature toggles and feature flags into maybe more robust compliance-driven in-house solutions that you already have that require certain stages or gates or approvals because it already exists, and there's an SDK and API to allow you to do that programmatically, of course. And then I think those are some of the key things just from an overall platform perspective that we hear from customers, and why they're looking at this really seriously at this point. Because either they're trying to do this homegrown, and I saw some mention, the folks, I appreciate you posting that in the chat. If you guys haven't seen it, Brian and Chris there posted, Launch Darkly, as well as, Azure DevOps. Azure DevOps does have some basic functionality, but it's limited to what you can do with this. Launch Darkly is obviously, further along in what solution. That's all they do is this, this notion of feature management. They have, they're out there doing their thing. I think they were started by some folks out of Atlassian, believe it or not. So there, there's some different, there's not many folks who are focused on this. And yeah, obviously, CloudBees is one of the providers out there.
I mentioned that there's two types of deployment methods with our solution. There's the SaaS solution, and now there's the self-managed on-prem version for highly secure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is important when you look at these solutions, right? It all depends on what your needs are. If you're looking at it, I mean, we have regulated customers. So, while we have our initial solution is SaaS today, we came out with an on-premise, right, that they can host internally because the regulated, in federal or even some financial said, hey, we want to host it ourselves. And we have that flexibility. That obviously these other folks don't, but it depends on what your needs are. What I wanted to do here, just to kind of put it in context, I'm going to just talk about a case study because I think it's important. Like, this is a real world example of all, like, saying, hey, these were problems that they had. It is a media company. This is kind of what we, a little bit of the same media company we're talking about, but it summarizes, it puts it in context for you guys to understand, hey, this is not, and this is what they told us and said, here's what our product teams want to do. Here's what our engineering teams want to do. Here are the problems we're trying to solve, right? For some fully automated push button deployments that are highly, that's just automated across their CI/CD, processes, and they need to move fast. And they've got accelerated delivery times. They've got season schedules and things to address. And they want to increase the number of releases. Obviously, they do each day, and experiment and just deliver a world-class experience, for their end users. And, there's a lot of different needs they have. And I think what's interesting to me, actually, this last one here, comment, just so that one of their key issues was that every feature released kind of negative, with the way they were doing it before, was like negatively impacting their sprints. And their sprints were getting delayed by many hours, right? Which put their projects at risk, and, there was increased costs and time. And, I used to be, I came from a services background and was a project manager, managed these agile projects. And when I put on my PMP hat, I look at this, and this is one of those things that, gives me a heart attack as managing this stuff in my former life. And, to say, wow, we got uncontrolled flags and config files in public cloud. We got, things that are impacting our release cycles, and it costs time and money. It doesn't really look good. At scale, as we, the more you do, and the more, the faster you try to do it, the more risk is that there for things to break, right? If you don't have a good system in place to manage it, of course, right? That's the idea here. And the results, right? When you look at their results of having this type of solution in place, right? They were able to do all this stuff, right? They were more responsive to their end users and the digital demand that was placed upon them. They were able to say, hey, we're going to experiment, we're going to build, we're going to measure, we're going to learn, we're going to iterate. They got away from these big bang application releases and the reactiveness of those to a much more predictable environment, right? That mitigated risk. And I think, you know, when you look at the savings and about this, the investment they made in this type of solution was you literally used to have anywhere from 20 to 40 people required to deploy and test, sitting around, different people doing things. After they implemented a feature management solution, they had one person, right? Going into the system, you know, clicking a button basically, which is incredible, right? To think about. And you know, again, they wanted to get out of the feature management or the release management business. And this completely changed the way they were able to move fast and break things and innovate in such a fast moving digital media world that we have today. So just one example, real world, you know, customer. And you know, look, CloudBees, we're a software company. Real simple. Look, we relaunched CloudBees.com. I think late last year. We acquired some companies. We had a relaunch of our website. You know, we're doing some innovative things ourselves. And normally they do a big bang, you know, website release. Instead, what they did is they had this website in a very controlled, you know, production ready environment that only internal employees could then go and provide feedback to, right? Where there was different groups that were able to, you know, view things or maybe perhaps edit things, and it was all in production. And they went from, you know, stressful big bang releases to delightfully boring launches of the new website. And it just, you know, again, this controlled the risk, created rapid feedback in a kind of a, you know, beta test canary type approach. And you know, so that's really what I kind of wanted to go over, just in terms of just helping you educate you guys. You know, we did want to do a demo. That's okay. Yeah. So what I want to do, I'm gonna have Greg take this over. I mean, the solution here. I mean, again, it's all about removing the burden here and moving faster and security and risk and experience. So I'm gonna turn the controls. I'll stop sharing here. I'll turn the controls over to Greg, and I hope you guys don't mind. I mean, he's gonna give you a good demo of what at least our solution looks like. And again, feel free. I appreciate the questions that folks are asking in the chat. Just keep them coming, and we'll respond, and we'll take live Q&A at the end. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Can you all see that?
No, not yet.
I can see it.
Okay.
Yeah, I can see it too.
Okay, awesome. So, you know, for this demo, so I'll be demoing CloudBees Rollout because that's what I have access to, but just the thing to keep in mind is, as we are talking about feature flags as a whole here. So I think a lot of the stuff that you'll be seeing is kind of applicable no matter which solution you're using here. I am going to be mostly focusing on the use cases that Rich mentioned earlier on, right? Separating deploy from release, then using the user segmentation and the gradual rollouts and things like that. So for the demo, you can see I'm in just a nice little locally hosted, this is a React, you know, JavaScript web application. And it's like a little music hosting website, right? And what we're gonna do for the very first part of the demo here is we are gonna go and we're gonna separate deploy from release, right? So first, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna jump into my code here. Give me 1 second. All right, I'm gonna save this. So first off, right, the idea here is I'm working on kind of like a brand new feature, right? You can see after I just did something, this is that new feature, right? This following users UI component, where basically, you know, let's say I've got my music hosting application. I decide that I would like, you know, the users of my website to see what users my artists are following, right? It's this right here. And we want to utilize feature flags as we're pushing this out. We want to separate the deployment of this code from the release of the feature itself, right? So first off, we're going to jump. This is kind of that initial rollout component of how we're actually implementing the feature flags in the code, right? Everything that Rich talked about, right? The first step of this is going to be in the code. As we saw, you're going to need that initial feature flag kind of conditional to determine if you're going to run a feature or not. So the flag that we're going to focus on is this following component flag. You can see very simple declaration here. It's just a Boolean flag. It can either be true or false, on or off. And then there's a couple of calls down here. Basically, we're registering with the rollout dashboard, which is again, since we're separating deploy from release, we're actually be controlling the flag values from a separate dashboard. And so that's these two calls here kind of create that connection between our code base and the dashboard itself. So if I jump into this user.jsx file that you saw me in earlier, right, as you can imagine, that's the code behind this page right here, right? And so for this following users UI component, again, you saw me this earlier, it's this user sidebar right here with this user followings code, right? The code that I'm highlighting is the code responsible for rendering this UI component. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that code and I'm going to wrap it in a conditional, right? So as you can see, all we're doing is we're checking if the following component flag is enabled, then go ahead and run the code. If it's not, do nothing, right? Null. And so one thing about our flags, right, when we define them in the code for the first time, they all have a default value, right? By default, if I define a flag like this, it'll be false by default if there's no input argument here. You can give it a parameter if you want. You can declare it as false. You can declare it as true. But in our case, we're just going to leave it to the default value of false so that when we get to this conditional, right, is the flag enabled? No, it's false. So we're going to go to the null. If I tab back out, you can see my little app rebuilt. Refresh the page here. You can see that this UI component is gone, right? So this is that very initial, sorry, let me go ahead and check the chat. Okay, so yeah, let me know if there's any questions. If you have any questions, feel free to definitely unmute yourself and ask me. But basically what we've done so far, right, if you can kind of immerse yourself in my imagination here, is we've taken this, right, this code is there. If this was our production level application, right, the code is there, is just turned off right now. So the feature is there, it's just not live. And so then we would go through our normal deployment process, right? We would push this out to production and it would be exactly like this, right? Because the flag value is false, the code is there, it's just waiting for some input to be turned on. And so now we're actually going to jump into the rollout dashboard and we're going to control the flag value from the dashboard itself. Any questions about this initial implementation? Take the silence as a no. Okay, cool. So now I'm going to jump into the rollout dashboard. Again, right, we've got our production level environment. That UI component is there. You all saw it, right? It's just turned off right now. And so when I jump into the dashboard here, you can see on the left-hand side, right, we have our current environments. For the sake of the demo, we're just going to pretend that we're doing this all in production, right? But you can see we can have dev, stage, pre-prod, and prod. You know, there's a question about running tests and things like that, right? So you can actually utilize your feature flags not only in the production environment, right? The normal deployment process is we would push this out into our development stage, and then on whatever our development environment on, we would test both versions of the flag, right? We would run our automated tests on our UI with the flag enabled and with the flag disabled. And if those tests pass, we promote it out to staging and then on to production, and so on and so on. And so this view right here, right, in the production environment, we can currently see which flags are active in my production environment with a rule set defined for them, right? But so what you don't see is that following component flag because we haven't set a rule for it yet. If you remember, right, that flag is just sitting there with its default value of false right now. So if I go in here and I click on create new experiment, and from this dropdown, I find the following component flag. This dropdown is populated by the flags that you define inside of this class here, right? We call this a container class. All the flags that you define initially in the code, they will be available to you to set rules in the dashboard, right? And so now we can take the following component flag and we can go ahead and click on set audience, which will allow us to set the rules for that flag without having to redeploy our application, right? So this is my live production version of my application. And now, right now, we have a rule in the UI saying that this flag is false. If we wanted to, right, let's say a week later or 2 weeks later, we're ready to turn this feature on, we're ready to release it, right? Somebody, doesn't have to be a developer, right? There's a pretty friendly UI. They can come in here and they can say, okay, instead of this flag being false, it's going to be true for all versions and all users of the application, right? You can see this is the default behavior. So as soon as I hit update audience, then the rollout dashboard will actually communicate with the user's device. You can see my little web app just refreshed. And if I go back, now you can see that the feature has been turned on. Right now for all users and all versions, this feature is on. Any questions about that? That's kind of your separating deploy from release process, right? So you saw that we pushed the code out. That was step one. Then the code sat there waiting for some input, and then, you know, any amount of time later, somebody can come in and decide, okay, this feature is ready to be turned on. We're turning it on, right? So now you can merge in incomplete code. You can have code out there that's not necessarily working until you get it working. You don't actually have to turn it on. And so then one thing I want to highlight is the kill switch that Rich talked about, right? Let's say we did decide to turn on this feature. We're not doing a canary deployment. We're just going about it. We're turning it on for everyone, full blast. We turn it on and, oh no, all of a sudden we realize that this UI component is breaking our site or something is off about it. It's driving users away, right? Then we have this option of a kill switch, which is this green active button in the top right. I can go ahead and click this, and you can see this actually gives me the option to kill the experiment, right? So as soon as I do this, you see that the rule that I have in place stays there. You know, so I know whenever we do fix it, we want to go back to the original rule we had. But you can see now the experiment is killed. All traffic of the experiment will receive the default value. And if remember, the default value is false. So now if I go back, we killed the feature that was broken for us, right? We shut it off for all of our users with a click of one button, right? We didn't have to roll back the application. There was no emergency patch. This is really nice for, you know, some of those DORA metrics, so the mean time to recover. Basically, you can fix an issue without it constantly affecting your users, right? You can first shut off the thing that's causing problems, then address it. Your users aren't aware that there was actually a feature that was broken for them. And then once you do fix it, you can go ahead and then reactivate it. So there's no questions. So that's kind of the simple, that initial, it is a simple use case of separating deploy from release, but for a lot of people, it is that most important one, right? It really frees up your developers. It speeds up that development lifecycle. You can kind of start pushing code out to production with that safety blanket of knowing that even though this code is going out there, it's not turned on. If we do push out something that's bad, we can very easily shut it off, right? So there's just that safety, that knowledge that what you're deploying out into production is safe. So that's that initial use case. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the gradual rollouts and the canary deployments, right? So you saw that we have these two options of true or false, right? We can have our flag be on or off, but we can also split the rule of our experiment here, right? And so I'm sure you can imagine, right? What this does is now we can say, okay, this feature will be on for a certain percentage of our user base and off for another, right? So in here, I'm setting it the feature on for 10% of my users and off for 90%, right? So this is how you would do that canary deployment. Is we would come in here, we would start out, we would release this feature to 5% of my user base, and then we would monitor, right? We would run analytics on how those 5% are interacting with the feature. And if everything is going great, right, we can either manually scale this up. I can come back in here later, scale this up to 10%, or we can set up some automation around this, right? Where we have set up our analytics. And if there's nothing, right, no issues in production, no failures, or users are still interacting with our site like they should be, then we can make an API call. Everything that you see me doing in the dashboard has an API behind it, right? We can make an API call and scale this rule from 5% to 10%. And then again, we monitor, make sure nothing's broken, scale this up from 10 to 20. And if there is an issue, right, if we dip below a certain threshold, or if we get a ton more support tickets coming in from the people whose, feature is set to true right now, again, it doesn't have to be manual, but we can just kill the feature entirely. We can do this with an API call. We can scale this back down, right? You can go back down to 10%, things like that, right? So this is how you would handle that gradual deployment, that canary release. And then the last kind of default option is the scheduled option, right? So very similar to the split deployment, but now you're assigning a date to a percentage value, right? So you can kind of fully lay out, with a strict scheduled plan of how you're actually going to run the canary deployment, right? Where I can say, 0% today, 10%, the next day or next month, 20%, so on and so on, right? And you can lay out a schedule like this. And what we've actually seen some of our customers do, which is really cool, is they'll use this for almost the opposite effect, right? When it comes time to sunset a feature, they'll use this option, right? Where you can have a feature turned on for all of your users today. And then you say, okay, a month from now, we're shutting this feature off, we're replacing it with a newer one. Instead of having a manual process about shutting this feature off, right? You just say, the code will still be there, we'll clean it up later, but the feature itself is being shut down for the entirety of our user base on a specific date. Any questions? Anything like that?
Don't be shy. I mean, is this helpful to the folks on the phone? I mean, I think it's, we talked about capabilities. Greg's kind of putting it in context of a full solution here. I mean, do you see, yeah, I know there was some good discussion. I mean, are there specific questions any folks have? Is feature management something that folks have heard of, or, are they looking at, are you looking at it in your respective organization? I'm just curious, does anyone have any insight they want to share about what maybe they're doing inside their respective company?
My company is just starting on this. So, I mean, we haven't even implemented anything.
I gotcha. And you're from, Brian, you're from where, Black Knight, or?
Yeah,
Black Knight, right? Yeah. Awesome. What about you, Chris? I had some comments there. Are you doing anything?
About a year ago, we brought in Launch Darkly, and we've integrated pretty heavily with it since then. So a lot of the things that you're showing here, we're actively doing. Still working on the group rollout, doing a lot more just on-off kind of things, and we haven't broken into the canaries yet.
No, and I think what you said there, from my experience, it is really common that I'm focusing on the heavily integrated part. I think so far what we've talked about is that initial use case, right, of separate and deploy from release, and then you integrate more and more heavily. I think it finds its way into your code really, really easily. And then from there, what I'll show in a second, right, you can start diving into the deeper use cases, right? So we talked about the canary deployment. Even the canary deployment I showed, it can get more complicated, right? You don't have just to do percentage based. You can start off by turning on a feature for users who you might consider beta users and things like that, right? And so I think that is really common across people who do start utilizing feature flags and feature management, is you just really find out how much you can use this for in the post-production world.
I have a quick question. This is Jesus Rodriguez. How you? I'm looking at the UI right now. So, how you keep track? We allow a particular enterprise company like a bank to be compliant with the government for auditing, for example, keeping in mind meeting the requirement for SOX regulation.
Yeah, so this is speaking to rollout specifically, and I imagine most solutions incorporate this, right? But there is, in order to be compliant, which we do a good job of, there's a really big focus on security, right? You'll see in a second, I'm going to talk about having the ability to use user properties to determine if you want to turn a feature on or off. So there's a really big security focus. So in terms of just being compliant for, SOC purposes, there's a focus on just permissions, right? Being able to restrict who can do what in what environment, right? So you can lock down the production environment if you want, really go through approvals, turning things on if that's a requirement. There is audit logs, which you can see I'm hovering over here. I'll click in here. Basically, there's logs saying who did what, when they did. Anything that happens in the UI will be reported through the audit logs in terms of, again, very applicable to the production environment, but not only to the production environment, right? Seeing who turned what on at exactly what time, who approved it, everything like that. And then, just from the security aspects of having this application, I'll talk about that in a second when I start talking about sorry, let me get back in here. Right, there is also the component of being able to use the user properties to see if you want to turn a feature on or off, right? And so at that point, specifically to roll out again, right, it's very secure in that scenario because we don't actually collect any user data, right? So even though you have the ability to enable and disable features based on user properties, the logic of actually checking that happens on either the user device or on your servers, right? So you're not actually transmitting any user data to the rollout servers. And so that keeps it secure, right? Because it's basically what you do to keep your data safe is all that happens with the data. And then for some, I know Tom mentioned there is that self-hosted version as well. If there are much stricter requirements where you're not able to use a SaaS solution because of those reasons, then there is the self-hosted solution. And that's even more powerful because everything that you're doing is on your network. All that logic happens either on your network or on the user devices as well.
Do you guys have any single sign-on integrations?
Yeah. For most of them, I think there is SAML single sign-on integrations, right? So you're able to set that up to authenticate into this, which I know is a really big requirement, especially with using SaaS. So there is single sign-on integration with Rollout specifically. Great questions, by the way. Thank you for being communicated with me. So one thing I want to show, right? So far, all the rules that we've set have applied to all of our users, right? We're able to turn things on, we're able to turn things off, or we're deploying something to 5% of our entire user base, right? But what we offer on top of that, right? As you start utilizing feature flags more and more in your application, when you become more mature with this, you want to start experimenting, right? You want to be able to see, okay, let me turn this feature on for this subset of users because I know, they really care about seeing this kind of stuff, right? So by targeting specific users, you're able to get more feedback on your development work, faster feedback, just get more information on your release process. And that's what we're offering here. Right, so we'll always have this default rule. You can see it's grayed out. I can't actually change this. You always want a default behavior, right? In case, you don't want somebody slipping through where no rule applies to them and then your application breaks or something like that, right? You're always going to have a default behavior available to you. And so what I did is I'm setting the default behavior to false, right? So right now for all versions and all users, this application is turned off, except, and now I can come in here and I can say, maybe this is a mobile application and only users who are on version 2.0 or higher of my application will get this feature, right? Maybe there's components in the code that only work on a 2.0 of my application or higher. Anyone coming in on a lower version, we never want this code running because it will cause issues. So then they would fall into the else bucket, right? The feature would not be enabled for them. Maybe I'm fine with all versions, but instead of all users, I want to use a user property to determine if a feature should be on or off, right? So now I can go into this property dropdown and I have this list of properties available to me that I can choose from. And so a really common one, would be user email, for example. And I can come in here and I can enter either specific values. If I have, maybe I have specific internal employees that I want to test this feature first. I can enter their emails, or I can do a regular expression match, right? So I can say anyone with a Gmail domain, very broad user group here, right? But this is just an idea of what you can do, right? Or maybe you have, plan, for example, right? And I can come in here and I can say only people who are plan tester, for example, right? I can do that. I can hit save. And now only users whose user property of plan is tester will have this feature enabled for them, right? And so hopefully what you're asking yourself is where's this property drop down populated, right? Where do we get email, country, right? So you can do geographic location, for example, right? Where do we actually get these? This isn't a rollout specific thing. It's not like we, scrape your application for this information. The way this works is any property that's available to you in the code, you can choose to map it to a property in the rollout dashboard, right? So you can see here in my web application, right? If we jump back to the code real quick, I have a user object, right? And that user object, you can see I'm calling it here by get user. That user object has the following properties, right? There's a plan, there's an email, there's a playlist count, there's an ID. And all I'm doing, one little line right here, right, is I'm taking the plan property that you see here in the dashboard and I'm mapping it to my user object's plan property, right? So the plan is a string, right? So in our case, a user plan, it could be an internal tester or they could be a beta user or something like that, right? And so now I can set this rule. And then once I hit update audience, the way this works is Rollout actually generates a JSON config file, right? Where each one of these experiments, each one of these rule sets will live on that JSON config file. And then when it comes time to actually check this conditional, right, when we're checking, is the following component flag enabled? You're checking against that JSON config file, right? You're not making an API call to the dashboard every time you need to check the conditional, right? When we get here, we're going to check against the JSON config file that has this rule in place, right? So then when it comes time to check if the flag is enabled, we would check, is my user a tester? If yes, it's enabled. If they're not a tester, then no, it's disabled, right? And now that's how this works without a redeployment. The code doesn't change, right? It's what it's checking. It's that file that is checking against that changes. And that's what allows you to do these kind of changes in real time, right? As you saw, my application was reloading. Anytime we made a push or anytime we made a change, right, there's a push that happened. The rollout dashboard lets the application know, hey, you just got a new config file. Go ahead and check if you need to refresh or not to update the view. Any questions about that? I know that's kind of a mouthful.
How do you assign the tester plan to a user?
Mm-hmm. That is a great question. So that is up to you in your code, right? So it's not really like a great description, but basically in my code, I have a user object, right? That user object has a plan property. So I can, you and your code have a way of identifying, what user is a user, right? So I have their email, for example. So maybe I have, as a company, maybe I have an option for users to register to be beta testers, right? And then so in my database, then I can check off if a user is a beta tester or not. And that's where this plan property is populated from, for example, right? And then I can put all of my internal employees, I can also say that they're testers, right? And so then you can use that property to determine this. What's cool, and I can kind of tie this in, is you can actually create target groups based off of user properties as well, right? So right now, our rule, we're looking at one property, right? But what you can do is instead of, picking one property that you're going to decide if you're going to turn a feature on or off on, you can create an entire target group, which again, it will be based off user properties, but you can combine multiple user properties. And what's nice about target groups is they're reusable outside of a single experiment, right? So I can define a target group, which I'll show in a second. I can create that beta user group, like we mentioned, right? I can create a beta user group. Maybe this is something that my customers can opt into. I don't know if any of you, I'm a big Roomba fan. And so I don't know if any of you have a Roomba, but they have an app and you have an option of actually like opting in for iRobot to test out like new Roomba features on your Roomba. But that there's like a little bit of an inherent risk because they're newer features, but you get some cooler stuff before anybody else does, right? So there's some risk and benefit to it. So maybe you have a similar option as a company where you let users opt in to be beta users. And so that's something you keep track of. And so now we can say, okay, at first go, let's turn a feature on only for our beta users. They know they might get some buggy stuff every once in a while. They're more forgiving than the rest of my user base, right? So I can create a rule like this where we turn something on just for the beta users, but not everybody else. One thing that's really cool about what I've been showing so far is we can actually apply our canary deployment idea to the more narrowed release as well, right? Where I can do a canary deployment on my beta users first, and then do a canary deployment on the rest of my user base, for example, right? Where I can come in here, maybe this is a super new feature. We don't know how anybody's going to react to it. Maybe even our beta users won't like it that much or something like that, right? So we can deploy it to 5% of our beta users and keep it off for 95% of our beta users. And then it's off for the rest of my users who aren't beta users, for example, right? So everything you saw me do earlier, kill switch still applies, right? You can get more fine-tuned with these rules that you make here. And I'll show you how you create a target group in just a second. I want to show kind of the last option here in this dropdown, right? So we've done regular user property. We've done target group, which is grouping users based on user property. So I'll show you what actually makes a beta user in a second. And then the last option available to you is a flags dependency. And so the idea here is you don't want to end up in a pickle where basically any application, right? Any application code, you're going to have features that depend on one another, right? And you don't want to end up in a situation where we turn off this user followings UI component and we forget that there's other pieces of our code that depend on this user UI component running, for example, right? So this flags dependency is a way to avoid that. Or I can say, the following component flag will only be true if the shuffle flag is also true for this user right now. right? So now if the two features depend on one another, there's never going to be a situation where the one flag that depends on the other will run without the one it depends on running, for example, right? And so now what's cool about this is the rules that apply to the shuffle flag can now apply to our following component flag as well, right? So if we want to test out multiple features at the same time on our beta users, we can through this mechanism. And there's a lot of really cool ways you can use this flags dependency. Cool. Any questions before I hop out of this view real quick, just to show you what a target group looks like?
Yeah, we good on time, James? Just to make sure. I mean,
yeah.
We were happy to stay and answer many questions you guys have. I mean, you got the right technical team here. I mean, you feel free. You got some brain power here, guys. These guys talk to a lot of different organizations and really dive deep into this stuff.
Yeah, I'm good with hanging on for a little while longer. I know that if some folks need a drop, that's cool. We'll be doing the $100 gift card giveaway. I did do a screen capture of some folks on the call. So we'll just, if you're not on the call while we do the giveaway, we'll make sure you get it. But I'm good to continue.
Awesome.
No, yeah. So I'll just show off the target groups real quick, and then we can turn it over.
Hey, I'm sorry, I have a question. So with all of this extra code you're adding in, is there any performance issues down the line? Let's say you have like 200 features, for example. Mm-hmm. Do you see any latency in your pages coming up, for example?
No, yeah, that's a great question that does get brought up a good amount, right? So there's kind of a couple of different areas where latency would come up. So one part that I mentioned is, as soon as I hit update audience, right, you can see my little tab refreshing, right? So what happens at that point is, as I mentioned, Rollout will generate a JSON config file and send that along, right? And you're checking against that config file for your rules, right? When it comes time to actually evaluate this conditional, you're checking against that config file, right? So there is a latency component when that config file is in transition or being sent from one location to another. But the config file is kept really, really small in the kilobytes. It's kept very minimal. So that is not for I've never heard of a customer having an issue from that component. The part that you asked, right? So okay, let's say we scaled up a ton. Our code is littered with these, right?
I hate messy code.
Yeah. And so from a latency component, the answer is no, right? Because it's a conditional, right? And it's a very simple one. You're checking, is this on or off? You're not running any complex algorithms to determine this. So there's not a latency aspect from that, but there is, like you mentioned, messy code, right? You are now gonna have more code, right? Basically, you're saying if the flag is on, do this. If the flag is off, do that. So there's that aspect. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that is kind of like it is a little bit of like a developmental shift in just how you approach this, right? Where now the feature flags that you're working on will need to be a part of your development process from planning, basically, right? So you're going to be adding this into your code, but what I think the more mature organizations do is these flags will not live in your code forever, if that makes sense, right? So
I got you.
Because eventually you fully tested the feature, that feature is going to work. You want to release it to your entire population. Once you're at that point, and what's nice is Rollout comes with some features that help you identify when a flag is no longer needed. And I think so does LaunchDarkly, so a lot of these other solutions, right? That is, I think, one of the more common questions, because you are adding more code. How do we help you avoid the messiness, right? And it just becomes part of that natural planning process that you've deployed the feature to production. It doesn't end there, right? Once the feature is fully turned on, there needs to be a step to come in here and remove this part from your code.
Gotcha. But then a code deploy will be needed to remove that code, though.
Yes. Yeah. But and then eventually, right? Since that feature is fully enabled, you just removing a conditional it's not a risky deploy in any way, right?
I gotcha.
Everybody knows that it works. But yeah, no, great question. Definitely.
When you said config file, I was like, okay, it just clicked in my head when you said that.
Right. No, yeah, but from the config file aspect, not any
Yeah, not
latency for checking that, or
Yeah, I didn't know if it was making database calls. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what confused me. I was like, yeah, that could get expensive
Mhm.
and time consuming.
So are you tracking any of the longevity of, so if it's been rolled out for like 2 months, is there a way of determining like how old
yeah,
something's been out there?
definitely. So you can see, this is pretty funny. Just talking about how these flags don't live forever, and here's my demo environment where we have 2-year-old flags. But yeah, no. So there is, and there's kind of multiple components to this where you can see when a flag was created. You can see when it was last touched. So like this one, for example, is probably no longer needed, right? It was last touched a year ago, and then there's this last component, which is this impressions component, right? Where I can go into my experiment and I can see over a certain time period how many users have interacted with this flag, and then which version of the flag they've gotten, right? So right now, okay, I've got a nice-ish split where people are getting 2 versions of the flag, so that probably means I don't want to turn it off just yet. But as you can see in my row likes here, I've had this amount of visitors over the last, I want to say I think it's set to 30 days by default, but they're all getting the false version of the flag. Nobody's touched this flag in a year. That becomes like what we call a stale flag. And so then I don't need this flag anymore. For over a year, everyone's been getting the off version. Why do we even have the on code in my code right now? Let's go and remove it, that kind of thing.
Is there notifications that can like send out emails when you hit like you're good to go with this feature? You can remove it basically.
Yeah, and so that is very, very close to coming out for rollout. So we're working on this stale feature, which is exactly that, right? Combining the impression with the impression count with which version of the flag and how long that flag has been out, combining that into like a notification system. Exactly.
Cool.
Great questions, by the way. Yeah, thank you for asking them.
Yeah, appreciate the engagement, guys. So I think, James, I mean, we're going to 6 o'clock, or what time were we going to wrap this? I just didn't know.
I think on the actual meetup, it wraps up at 6. So
okay. Yeah, we got a couple of minutes. I mean, if there are other questions, feel free to shoot them out. I'm going to do the Amazon gift card raffle, of course, too. We got that. And look, if you guys, I think I know it was posted in the chat in case you missed it, but you can get started. Look, there's a free trial. Just get moving, and if you have questions, of course, feel free to reach out to me, Greg. I mean, we put our contact information in here, of course, and I'm happy to educate you or other folks on your team about this. Any other questions, technical or otherwise, for the folks remaining? I guess the silence is good.
awesome. Well,
all right. Well, I will do the raffle, and we randomly use the random name generator, and the winner is going to be Vipul Madan. So Vipul Madan, he's not on, but he was on. I think he dropped off a few minutes ago. But he is the winner. We'll make sure Vipul gets his gift certificate in digital format and can spend his winnings over at everyone's favorite Amazon.com. All right.
Well, hey, Rich and Greg, I really appreciate it. This has been great content and information. Thanks for doing this for us.
Yeah, cool. And I guess you'll post the recording out on YouTube and share the link in the meetup.
Absolutely. Usually it takes me a little bit because for some reason Zoom splits the recording up and I have to recombine it, but I'll get that done this week.
Got it. Yeah, perfect. All right, guys. Well, I appreciate everyone's time. Greg, thank you. That was fantastic. And thanks, folks, for joining on a Thursday afternoon. Hopefully you'll have some beverages and some food and enjoy your quarantine evening. I think we're on the tail end of this. We'll get out and enjoy some sunshine in the greater Tampa Bay or whatever area you guys are at. All right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hey, thanks everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, guys.